You know the story, or at least you think you do. A small town, a boy disappears, a secret lab buried beneath the surface, a girl with unnatural abilities, and a door ripped open to something that was never meant to come through. But what if I told you it was real? Before Hawkins, before 11, before the Upside Down, there was Montauk, a place where the government experimented on children, a place where psychics were turned into weapons, a place where thoughts became flesh, and fear took shape. The Netflix series Stranger Things was almost called Montauk because it was inspired by something far darker than fiction. A project whispered about by those who say they survived it. A hidden base, a machine that turned the mind into a gateway, and a monster that came through when that door was left open. This is the story that inspired Stranger Things. But this story is no fiction, because the door to Montauk was opened, and some believe it was never truly closed. Welcome to Sanctum Obscura. Duncan Cameron stood at the edge of the dark hallway, his breath slow and measured, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. He was trained to control his reactions, to suppress fear, but this place had a way of pulling it out of you anyway. He smelled it the moment the elevator doors slid open. That sour metallic scent, ozone mixed with sweat and machine oil. It clung to everything down here. A choking fog that settled in your lungs and never quite left. The hallway stretched ahead, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights, humming faintly overhead. The bulbs buzzed like dying insects, casting cold, sterile light over peeling paint and rusted metal pipes lining the walls. The concrete beneath his boots was damp, the air heavy with humidity, like he had stepped into the throat of some sleeping beast. The guards flanking him were silent, stiff, almost robotic. Their boots clicked against the damp floor in unison, the only sound besides the faint hum from deeper within the facility. Duncan clenched his jaw. He knew the hum well. It was the chair. It was awake. He felt the itch behind his eyes, like it was already reaching for him, even though he was still 3 corridors away from the room. "This way," said one of the guards, his voice low, devoid of anything human. Duncan felt their eyes on his back as he moved forward, but they weren't watching him out of duty. They were afraid. Everyone down here was afraid. Duncan was led into a small side room, bare except for a metal table, 2 chairs, and a clipboard resting on the surface. There was no clock. No window, no sound beyond the ever-present hum coming through the walls. He sat down and the chair groaned under his weight. His muscles tightened. Dr. Hendricks entered a few moments later. Tall, thin like a vulture, with a face carved into harsh lines by stress and years of secrets. His glasses were smudged, his lab coat creased, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone who had spent so long working underground. Duncan despised him. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't, but because he was indifferent. Men like Hendricks didn't hate you. They didn't see you as human, an instrument to be used until you broke. "How are you feeling?" Hendricks asked, sitting across from him, flipping open the clipboard. Duncan paused. He knew the right answer. "Fine," he lied. Hendricks barely looked up. "Good. We need you clear-headed today. We're going deeper than before. We need you to hold the projection for as long as possible." He knew what that meant. He had felt it during the last session, the chair pulling him further than it ever had before. He had seen the edges of something dark, something moving beneath the surface of his thoughts, and it had seen him back. But saying no was not an option. Duncan had been brought into the program years earlier, plucked from obscurity because of his gift. his psychic sensitivity. From a young age, he could sense things others couldn't. People's thoughts bled through like faint whispers. Sometimes he dreamed of events before they happened. Other times he saw things that made no sense at all. Visions of places he had never been, beings that didn't belong in this world. The government found him when he was 19. Or rather, they took him. They told him it was for national security. Told him he was special, important. Told him he would help keep America safe. But the truth came later. After the drugs, the conditioning, the tests that left his mind cracked open like a raw nerve. And then came the chair. The escort to the experiment chamber was the longest part of the day. Down 2 more levels, the air growing heavier, the hum growing louder. Duncan could hear the computers before he saw them. Machines processing data at impossible speeds, tapes spinning, lights flickering in rapid succession. The temperature dropped the closer he got to the chair, as though the machine itself was sucking the warmth from the air. The guards stopped at the door. They never entered the chamber unless something went wrong. Duncan stepped inside. The chair was waiting for him. The room was circular, lined with machines, each connected to the chair like veins feeding into an artificial heart. The chair itself was an ugly thing. Cold, metallic, its wires slithering like living roots into the concrete floor. Above it, strips of fluorescent lights flickered unevenly, buzzing like angry wasps. The air smelled faintly of burnt plastic and hot metal. The walls were reinforced with lead, but Duncan sometimes wondered if they were meant to keep something out, or to keep something in. Technicians moved like ghosts, quiet, focused, avoiding his gaze. They knew what this machine did to people. Duncan approached the chair like a man approaching the gallows. His fingers trembled as he lowered himself into the seat. The metal was cold against his back. The electrodes pressed into his temples, the band tightening around his skull like a vice. He heard the technician's voice, dry, monotone. System initializing, neural sync activating. The hum grew louder. The room vibrated around him. His pulse quickened. Dr. Hendricks leaned over him. "Clear your mind, Duncan. Focus. We need you to go deeper today." But inside, he was screaming. When the machine surged to life, Duncan felt his mind expand outward like a shockwave. The walls dissolved. The room stretched into infinity. He felt his thoughts uncoil, slipping into places they shouldn't go. He saw flickers, faces, landscapes, ruins, skies filled with things that shouldn't fly. And then he felt it, a presence just beyond his vision. Something watching, something waiting, and the hum grew louder. Duncan's pulse quickened as the hum of the chair deepened, low, resonant, vibrating in his bones like the growl of a massive engine buried beneath the earth. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the world, but the machine wouldn't let him. It was inside him now, plugged into his thoughts, pulling at the loose threads of his mind. A cold voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Hendricks, we're increasing the amplitude. Neural sync stable. Duncan, I need you to focus." The hum shifted into a high-pitched whine, like metal scraping against glass. Duncan's teeth vibrated in his skull. He felt his mind stretching outward, like a tether being pulled through the dark. The room faded. At first, he saw nothing but static, blurry shapes, flickering light like an old television struggling to hold a signal. Then it sharpened. The future. A city that shouldn't exist. Silent towers, smooth and unnatural, stretching into a sky that wasn't quite right, grey but shimmering, like oil on water. The air there seemed heavy, thick, like it carried weight. Duncan could feel it even from here, pressing on his chest, slowing his breath. And at the city's center stood the monolith. A black obelisk, towering, unnatural. It didn't reflect light, it absorbed it. He couldn't tell how tall it was. It seemed endless, stretching beyond the sky itself. And it was wrong. It didn't belong. Duncan felt it in his gut. The kind of dread that makes your limbs weak, the kind you feel when you know you shouldn't be somewhere, but you can't turn back. But the worst part, he knew it was alive. It was watching him. There were no eyes, but it saw him, felt him, knew him. Duncan tried to pull away, tried to break the connection, but the chair held him fast. The monolith pulsed just once, a low vibration that made his ribs ache, and then came the voices. They weren't human. A chorus of whispers, layered over one another, speaking in fragments, languages he couldn't understand, but his mind twisted them into meaning anyway. We are here. You opened the door. We are waiting. Duncan gasped, his chest tightening, panic rising like bile in his throat. He wanted to scream, to rip himself free from the machine. But he couldn't. The chair wouldn't let him. From outside the vision, the control room was tense. Technicians watched Duncan's body stiffen in the chair, his jaw clenched so tightly they thought his teeth might crack. His breathing grew shallow, ragged, his pulse spiked. Dr. Hendricks leaned in, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "Duncan, what do you see? Stay with it, describe it." Duncan's voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. "The city, the tower, it sees me. It knows I'm here." Static hissed over the speakers. The room chilled, though no one touched the temperature controls. The hum in the walls grew lower, deeper, almost organic, like a heartbeat. One of the technicians shifted nervously, whispering to another, "The readings are spiking. Something's wrong." His eyes were locked on Duncan. "Go deeper." The chair surged again. Duncan's mind stretched further into the dark. He fell through time. The future collapsed into the past. He was in Egypt, sandstorms raging around the half-built pyramid. Workers hauled massive stones under the sun, their bodies thin, eyes hollow. But something was wrong here too. Overseeing the workers were figures too tall, heads elongated, eyes black and reflective. They moved with an eerie precision, like they were not quite human. And then he was yanked forward again, faster this time. Through decades, centuries, millennia, until he crashed into the present. Duncan's eyes snapped open, but he wasn't in the chair anymore. He was floating, or maybe falling, into a void, a rip in reality itself. Colors that shouldn't exist smeared together, violet and green bleeding into blackness. The hum turned into a screech, a grinding, unnatural wail. And then he saw it. Something moving beyond the rift, shifting, pulsing, crawling against the edges of existence. Its limbs didn't move right. It folded into itself and unfolded again, like a thing trying to wear the shape of something human but failing. Its eyes, if they were eyes, flared bright, red like coals in a dying fire. And it reached toward him. Duncan screamed, loud enough that the technicians jumped back from their monitors. Inside the control room, alarms blared. The power flickered, lights dimmed and surged again. The hum in the walls became a roar, like metal scraping against bone. Technicians shouted over each other, pulse activity off the charts. Temporal distortion, 4.3 seconds off normal time. Shut it down. Dr. Hendricks stood frozen for a second too long. He had seen Duncan pushed further than ever before. He was seeing history unfold. The future. Proof. He wanted more. But then the temperature in the room dropped. Suddenly, sharply, as if all the heat had been sucked out into the void. Duncan's voice came through the intercom, weak, broken. "It's coming through." And then the walls shuddered. The concrete groaned, as if the earth itself was trying to push something back down. The rift opened. The technicians managed to cut the power. The chair hissed, metal cooling, steam rising from its base. Duncan collapsed forward, trembling, eyes wide, pupils dilated, mouth dry as sand. He could still see it when he blinked, the thing behind the rift, crawling, pressing against the edges of reality like an insect trapped under glass. Hendricks crouched next to him, hand on his shoulder. "What did you see, Duncan?" His voice was steady, but Duncan could hear the hunger in it. Duncan looked up at him, tears streaming down his face, lips quivering. "The door," he whispered. "It's open." Hendricks stared at him for a moment, then nodded to the guards. Get him out of the chair, prep for another session tomorrow. But Duncan knew there wouldn't be a tomorrow, because the thing in the rift had seen him now, and it wasn't going to let him go. Duncan lay on the stiff cot in his small, sterile room deep inside Camp Hero, his body cold, his mind burning. The after effects of the chair session still rippled through him. His skull throbbed with an ache so deep it felt like something was trying to crawl out of his brain. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images wouldn't go away. The city, the monolith, the whispers, the thing in the rift. It was all still there, pressed against the inside of his mind like fingerprints smeared on glass. The walls of his room were too thin. He could hear the hum of the machines, the distant murmur of scientists in the halls, the rhythmic footfalls of the night guards patrolling the underground levels. But underneath all of that, there was something else. Something. Breathing. Not human breathing. Something deeper, heavier. A slow, drawn-out inhale. A pause. Then another. It wasn't in the hallway. It wasn't in the next room. It was inside him. Duncan jerked upright, gasping for air, his body slick with sweat. But the breath in the room, the other breath, didn't stop. It wasn't him. The air in his room grew thick, heavy, suffocating, like the very molecules were shifting, compressing around him. The dim, buzzing ceiling light flickered, then went out entirely. And in the darkness, something moved. A shadow curling along the corners of the room, a shape that shouldn't have been there. It had come back with him. The Montauk base security room was dead silent, except for the soft crackling of radio static. A single officer, slouched in his chair, watched the screens lazily. Nothing ever really happened this late. The monitors displayed the usual grainy black and white security feeds, the dimly lit hallways, the locked doors to level 3, where the chair experiments were conducted, the storage bays where classified files were kept. Duncan's room. His was the only occupied room on this floor. The test subjects were always kept separate. The guard yawned, rubbing his eyes. Then he saw it. Duncan's camera feed flickered. Not just a glitch. It wavered, like something was interfering with the signal. The static hissed. The screen went black for 3 full seconds. When it came back, Duncan's bed was empty, but the door hadn't opened. No movement, no sign of him leaving. And then, something stepped into the frame. Something that wasn't Duncan. It stood in the center of the screen, hunched, breathing slowly. 2 glowing red eyes blinked open, and then the feed cut to black. The blaring of emergency sirens jolted Dr. Hendricks awake. He stumbled out of his cot, throwing on his lab coat, heart hammering. The red emergency lights in the hall strobed, making everything seem disjointed, unreal, a nightmare frozen in flashing frames. Guards ran past his door, weapons drawn, barking orders into their radios. Hendricks stepped into the hall, grabbing a nearby officer. What the hell is going on? The man's face was pale, eyes wide and unfocused. He looked like he was struggling to even find words. "Sir, it's Duncan." Hendricks felt his stomach drop. "What about him?" The guard shook his head, mouth opening, but no words came. And then, from somewhere deep in the base, down the corridor toward the lower levels, something roared. Not a human scream, not a machine malfunction. Something huge, something hungry. Hendricks' blood went cold. The chair worked. But they had pulled something through that never should have been brought here. The first victims never saw it coming. 2 armed guards patrolling the lower levels were torn apart before they could even fire a shot. The security cameras caught glimpses of it, just flashes between static interference. A towering figure covered in dark, matted fur, its limbs impossibly long, its back hunched. Glowing red eyes burning like fire. Claws, long, jagged, shifting in and out of focus, like they weren't fully bound to this reality. And its mouth, gaping, lined with too many teeth, breathing out air that came in deep, animalistic huffs. When it moved, it didn't move right. It wasn't natural. It flickered like it existed in 2 places at once. One moment it was 5 feet away, the next it was right in front of them. Then they were gone. The entire base went into lockdown. Steel blast doors slammed shut. Emergency lights strobed violently. The sound of boots echoed as security forces flooded the hallways, weapons trained, sweeping for the source of the disturbance. Dr. Hendricks stood behind the glass observation deck, staring down into the lower halls. Then he saw it. The thing that had come through Duncan. It was crouched at the far end of the corridor, clawed hands pressed against the walls, sniffing the air. Then its head snapped toward him. Hendricks' breath caught. It saw him, and it smiled. The thing let out a guttural, rattling growl, then launched itself forward with inhuman speed. The lights above exploded, sparks raining down as it moved. It smashed through the first wave of guards like they were made of paper. The gunfire barely fazed it. Bullets ripped into it, but it barely reacted. Because it wasn't entirely here. And nothing can kill something that doesn't fully exist. A technician with shaking hands screamed into the radio, "We can't stop it. Nothing is working. What do we do?" Dr. Hendricks' mind raced. The beast wasn't natural. It wasn't from here. It came through Duncan, which meant it was still connected to him. He turned to the remaining technician. "Cut the power to the Montauk Chair, now." "But, sir..." "Now!" The base-wide blackout initiated. All lights died. The hum of the machine silenced. And then, in the dark, the beast let out a final piercing shriek. For a moment, the entire base trembled, walls vibrating, air compressing, and then it vanished, like it had never been there at all. Duncan was found hours later, curled up in the fetal position, shaking. His eyes were unfocused, body drenched in sweat. Hendricks knelt beside him. "Duncan, what did you do?" Duncan's voice came out in a whisper, hollow and distant. "I didn't bring it here," he murmured. "Then what?" Duncan's pale, trembling lips formed the words. "It followed me. And it's still out there." The beast was gone. At least that's what they told themselves. But the silence it left behind was worse. When the lights flickered back on, the hallways of Camp Hero were painted with blood. Chunks of meat that had once been men were smeared across the concrete walls. Boots, still containing feet, sat where their owners had been ripped apart. The smell of iron and burnt wiring blended with something else, something sour and wrong, like rot mixed with static electricity. It wasn't just death. It was contamination. Reality itself had been wounded. The guards who survived stared at nothing, eyes vacant, hands trembling around weapons that had done nothing to save their comrades. Some couldn't stop crying, their bodies rocking like children trying to soothe themselves. Others stood frozen, still pulling their triggers on empty rifles, not realizing the thing they were shooting at had vanished into thin air. And Duncan, he was broken. He was taken back to his room, though cell felt more appropriate now. Sedatives were forced into his veins to keep him from screaming. But the drugs didn't stop the visions. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rift. saw the creature moving through it, crawling over the bones of other things that had tried to escape before it. He saw the city, the obelisk, pulsing as though it had been awakened the moment Duncan's mind had touched it. And he heard the voice from beyond the rift. Clearer now. You brought us here, we are inside you now. He awoke with a jolt, drenched in sweat, heart racing so fast he thought he might die right there on the cot. But part of him hoped he would, he knew the truth. The chair wasn't just amplifying his thoughts, it had made him a beacon, a signal, calling to something that had been waiting beyond the fabric of time. And now it had his scent. Dr. Hendricks stood above the bodies in the corridor, his face pale, his expression unreadable. The cleanup team arrived the next day. Men in black suits, gloves, and masks moving with military precision. No insignias, no names. They erased everything. The blood, the bullet holes, the ruined equipment. The remains of the dead were packed into black body bags, though some bags were disturbingly small, containing only pieces. The walls were washed down with chemicals that made Hendricks's eyes burn, but the smell was still there, the sour, metallic stench of something not from here, and the hum, faint, but still there, beneath everything. The chair had been turned off, but the air still vibrated. A week later, Hendricks sat at a long metal table in the highest level of the facility, Level 1, the clean level, where the upper brass held their closed-door meetings. A man in a grey suit sat across from him, expressionless, clipboard in hand. His voice was cold, practiced, the kind that had given orders that ended lives before breakfast. You will classify the incident as a containment failure during electromagnetic testing. Hendricks opened his mouth to object. He wanted to say something, anything. But the man continued, not even looking up. The Montauk Chair experiments are suspended indefinitely. The lower levels are to be sealed. All witnesses will sign indefinite security agreements under threat of treason charges, those considered unstable. He paused, flipping a page on the clipboard. Will be handled appropriately. Hendricks' throat tightened. He knew what handled appropriately meant. Erased, disappeared. He thought of Duncan, trembling in his cot, eyes bloodshot, mumbling to himself about doors that couldn't be closed. The blast doors leading to Level 3, the chair room, the rift, were welded shut. Steel plates were bolted over them. Concrete was poured over the seams like an artificial scar, sealing the wound but leaving it festering underneath. But the personnel who worked the deepest levels knew the truth. The air still felt wrong. The hum was still there. Sometimes, guards passing the sealed entrance would swear they heard faint scratching from the other side. Duncan was kept sedated for weeks. They told him he was free to go, eventually. But he knew he wasn't. He was no longer a person. He was a liability. A loose end. One night a soldier came to his room, young, barely older than Duncan, but his face was already dead. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, fingers flexing over the grip of his pistol. They want you gone," he said, his voice cracking. "But I'm getting you out. I can get you out." Duncan stared at him, numb, almost confused. "Why?" The soldier shifted on his feet. "I heard what you saw." He glanced nervously at the walls as if they could listen. It ain't over. Whatever you brought through, it's still here somewhere. I can feel it." Duncan didn't ask questions, he just nodded. That night, Duncan was smuggled out through an old maintenance tunnel that led to the coastline. He emerged into the salty night air, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, but the hum was still faint in the back of his mind. He didn't look back. He never came near Camp Hero again, but the chair was still there. The rift was still there. And whatever followed him through was still down there. Visitors to Camp Hero today say the base is abandoned, but some who stray too close to the sealed doors feel it. The vibration, the hum. Some hear faint voices under the wind. Some say their phones glitch, their compasses spin wildly. And some hear the low growl, deep guttural, like something breathing just beneath the earth. There are rumors among locals, whispers that hikers have vanished near the radar tower. That sometimes at night a tall shadow with red eyes can be seen stalking the tree line. Duncan was never the same. He lived the rest of his life in fear, changing names, moving from state to state, but the hum always followed him. The chair made him a beacon. The rift branded him. The thing that followed him was never far away. And at Camp Hero beneath the concrete, the air still breathes. Because once you open a door to something beyond time, you can never truly close it. Thank you for watching this video by Sanctum Obscura. If you enjoyed unraveling the darkness with us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some mysteries are better left in the shadows. See you next time.